Good morning. We are today the third day of our conference, and we are going to have a plenary session with our guest from Turin. I'm presenting you. It's so fine. It's fine. We are on our third day of the conference, and I'm very happy and pleased to present you Ugo Mattei, our friend and colleague, and a great resistant, militant. Ugo Mattei is the Alfred and Hannah Frum Professor of International and Comparative Law at the University of California, Hastings College of the Law in San Francisco, and a full professor of civil law in the University of Turin, Italy. He is the academic coordinator of the International University College of Turin, a radically new school where issues of law and finance in global capitalism are critically approached. He's also currently a columnist for the Italian newspaper Il Manifesto. Mattei has been a visiting scholar at Yale Law School and Trinity College and Wolfson College, University of Cambridge, visiting professor at Oslo, Berkeley, Montpellier, Macau. In 1985, he joined the law school at the University of Trento as an assistant professor, and he received tenure as a full professor in 1990. In Trento, he taught civil law and introduction to African law and institutions. In 1992, he was appointed as a professor in the Faculté Internationale de Droit Comparé, Strasbourg, where he served for 4 years. In 1993, Ugo Mattei taught as a visiting professor of Hastings faculty, and the year after, he was appointed to the Hastings faculty as the first holder of the Frum Chair in International and Comparative Law, succeeding Rudolf Schlesinger in teaching comparative law. He also teaches law and economics. In 1997, he accepted a call from the University of Torino Faculty of Law to succeed Rodolfo Sacco in the chair of civil law. He is a full member of the International Academy of Comparative Law, a member of the Executive Committee of the American Society of Comparative Law, a member of the Advisory Board of the Fribourg Institute of Comparative Law, and an advisor to the Institute of Law, Economics and Finances to Copenhagen Business School, a general editor of the series Common Core of European Private Law, Trento Project, at Cambridge University Press, a series editor of European Private Law in Context at Kluwer International, and an editor-in-chief of Global Jurist. He's a member of the editorial board of the International Review of Law in Economics and a new Palgrave Dictionary of Economics and Law. Mattei's scholarship is broadly multidisciplinary. He has published many books and more than 100 and other publications in English, Italian, French, Portuguese, Russian, and Chinese. His book in English, written with anthropologist Laura Nader-Plunder, Where the Rule of Law is Illegal, has been translated in 5 languages. But Ugo Mattei oriented the focus of his research on the study and practice of the commons after successfully masterminding a nationwide referendum against privatization of water in 2011 in Italy. His Italian bestseller Beni Comuni, Un Manifesto, has generated much attention throughout European social movements. Mattei experimented some of the ideas developed in that book in Naples as the president of the local water company from 2012 to 2014, in Chieri as a deputy mayor in 2014 and 2015. And he's currently leading a project on commons with the Sacchi Bailey, International University College of Turin, and Filippo Valguenera Orenbro University in the context of the Common Core of European Private Law, In 2015, together with the ecologist and scientist Fritjof Capra, he has published The Ecology of Law, toward a legal system in tune with nature and community. And we are very pleased and happy to hear today's Ugo's address on social movements as legislators, the making of bottom-up institutions of the commons. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be again in Belgrade after not too much time actually, but this is like the third or the fourth time in my life, so I've been here before. Today I will try to share with you some thoughts. The title of this presentation is actually taken from an article that I published a few years ago in the Festschrift for Antonio Negri and in the Indiana Journal of Global Legal Studies that was called Social Movements as a Constituent Power. But I will not do a formal, boring, theoretical presentation because I don't think is the right audience. I think it's a good thing to share some ideas and actually to show what is actually happening in the domain of the construction of legal institutions stemming from social movements. It is less of a theoretical speech and more of a story of a recent history that I would theoretically make begin, at least because it is somewhat Italian-centric in my narrative. I will make it believe in 2001 in Genova at the protest against the G8 that generated some very serious repression from the police, and that killed a young activist during the protests themselves. It generated a lot of litigation after that. There have been some of the tops of the police officials and that were actually charged, and few of them have been condemned, and few of them have been promoted in very high positions in the Italian police system, as you can imagine. So that was the beginning. So it's a short history, but in a way I was thinking yesterday, walking here in front of the river, that in 2001 there was no Dubai. Basically the whole new part of Dubai didn't exist. So it's just 18 years, 17 years, but in 17 years a lot of things can happen politically and also physically in the world. If some of you have seen or want to see a picture of Dubai, it's pretty actually impressive. The amount of building and construction and transformation of oil into buildings that happened in that part of the world in this short period of time. So it's short, but not so short. Okay. 2001 in Genoa, there were movements that were called in some way no global. That was the way in which they were referred to, at least in the main newspapers. Among those movements, the story is very that we have here at Donatella, so I will not kind of enter into an area that is not my expertise. But among those movements, a small one in Italy, a smaller one, that was the one on water as a common. There was the movement that was actually claiming that water was at risk of being privatized, was to become one of the real sources of tension, of global tension and on international issues in the near future, and that it needed to be run outside of the logic of capitalism. We needed to be able to run water in a way that was completely outside of the capitalist system of extraction. That was the main idea, and the idea was that in order to do that, the water should be in some way seen as a common, okay? Like air, something that is not produced. No humans can produce water. Water is a gift of God in a way, if for those that believe in God, it's a production of nature for those that don't, but certainly is not something we can do, okay? and we can make. And so that was the beginning, in a way, in Italy of the commons movement. Of course, the commons were already emerging in other parts of the world. In 1995, there was the politicization of the commons as an idea in Chiapas with the insurgence of the Zapatista movement. It was the same year of the signature of the NAFTA agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So the first time in which it appeared very clearly that there was a very strong alliance between global capital and institutions of the state. And this global alliance was not that the state could control the capital, but in fact that what happened was the other way around. That capitalist institutions, private institutions, were able to control governments and to persuade governments to do stuff that were in the interest of capital and not in the interest of their own people. That's the sort of change in the context that appeared very clearly in the 90s as a consequence, I believe, of the fall of the socialist alternative and the the decline of the incentives of capitalism to actually take care of labor and not only of capital itself. Okay, so basically what happened was in the 90s, this ratio of power between the public institutions of the state and the private institution, the private capitalist institution, the corporation, and so on and so forth, shifted. Okay, for the first time, we had an imbalance in power, so that now Leviathan was not anymore stronger than the private actors, was actually weaker. So to the point that maybe Leviathan migrated from the public into the private. You know, that's theories of empire and stuff describe that phenomenon. This is a crucial phenomenon to understand the commons, and we have to take it into consideration very much. Because especially here, I don't think there are many lawyers, but those of you who experienced and ever entered the law school, wherever in the West, will know that lawyers behave as if that change didn't happen. Okay? So I should organize a class action of students against law schools worldwide, because law schools tell them a story that simply doesn't exist anymore. Okay? Lawyers believe in the existence of a vertical structure of sovereignty, the fact that the law is produced by the sovereign, the fact that the law has some sort of public nature in itself. This is not true anymore. The power ratio is changed dramatically, and the moment in which this was perceived in its consequences was with the NAFTA agreement in America, because the NAFTA introduced a principle that is discussed even now, which is that corporations can invest, and their investment is a property right that is stronger than the states. In other words, if a corporation invests money in Chiapas to plant bananas and has a certain kind of legal landscape, the state cannot change it in the interest of the people, in the interest of the environment, in the interest of nothing, because if they do that, they get sued in front of a court, in front of a panel of the NAFTA, and they have to compensate as a taking the corporation for the investment that were reduced in their return by the intervention of the state in the interest of society and the interest of the environment. So it's a big change, okay? There is a global guarantee of investment and returns of investment against the possibility of governments to take care of their own people. So that model emerged over there, and you know, it is recently, there are the discussions in the European Parliament about the agreements with Canada and others. You know, this is actually one of the models that that emerged, and that actually was stopped by social movements, at least at the time. 1999, you remember Seattle? There were the moment in which that kind of model was stopped from becoming the entire structure of the WTO. Okay, so so to say, the NAFTA becoming the structure of the WTO was stopped in 1999. Meanwhile, you know, in Chiapas, there emerged the idea of the commons as the victim of this sort of pincher, you know, between governments and capital. So there is no anymore, this is very important theoretically, there is not anymore an alternative between government and private property, okay, as two polar opposites, as a zero-sum game. This idea being the fundamental structure of modernity. So that is to say, whatever goes to the private, more private means less public, more public means less private. The left is for more public and less private. The right is for more private and less public. Okay, zero-sum game between private and public, between property and sovereignty, and this binary vision that looks at the public as opposing the private doesn't exist anymore. What there is here is an alliance between the private and the public against the common. Okay? These are institutions of centralization of power, institutions of exclusion. They might be private or public, doesn't matter. They all work in the same direction, which is transformation of commons into capital. And the commons is in between. Okay? The commons, which is the diffused power of the people, the commons, which is what the social movements in a way represent, okay, is actually the great suffering aspect of this alliance between private and public that emerged with the NAFTA and so on and so forth. So this is the theoretical structure. Okay? In Italy, 2001, as I already said, there were the Genova the events, and after that, the whole thing was stopped by September 11. So we are in a moment in which we've been in a political moment which is very close to us, but is still making pretty much the dynamic of our present. Okay. So what happened then later was that the commons became also around that time an area of legitimate scholarly inquiry. In the United States, famous book of Elinor Ostrom came out in 1990. A lot of work was done by sociologists and economists in the field. Lawyers in America also were doing their own part, very formalistically, but they were working on the commons. In Italy, the whole story was completely disconnected from academia. It was much more, at the beginning, a political move. And the political move was a group of people criticizing the huge amount of privatizations that happened in my country. Italy privatized 130 billion euros of resources between 1990 and 1993, which is a huge amount of privatizations. It's just the second in the world after Margaret Thatcher's one. All of those was done by leftist governments, okay? Which, parentheses, are the ones that bombed you guys here in that period of time. So that was the structure in Italy. So the movement for the commons in Italy came out as a resistance against further privatization. That resistance was a resistance in terms of defending water against privatization, and a resistance in terms of developing alternatives to the private-public opposition, especially in making some legislation about public property in the civil code. Okay? Some of us, me, Rodotà, and others, studied privatizations. We figured out that privatization were not a good thing, at least not as an ideology, as in general as it was at the time. And we did some work about that, and then we lobbied basically the Prodi government at the time, 2006, 2007, in order to have the Italian civil code modified in order to include the commons. And that was 2007. A commission was put in place by the Italian Ministry of Justice, the Commissione Rodotà, and this commission actually started to discuss how to introduce public property in the civil code and how to protect public property against privatization. The issue was public property is too easy to privatize everywhere. This is a problem throughout the West. Every government that seeks privatization can just do it. It's part of its own political discretion. You run for office, you decide you want to privatize any building in the city, any part of the city. If you get the vote, you do it, and you sell it. But you are selling something that then, is not something that the government owns, because the government is in office for just a short period of time. If you sell public property, you are giving away something that doesn't belong to you, belongs to the people. okay? And if you change your mind, the next government, and decides, okay, now I renationalize, they simply cannot do it anymore. Because nationalization is very much difficult according to the law everywhere. You need to prove, you need to show that there is a public interest, you need to pay compensation, you need a law to transfer from the public, from the private into the public, okay? So the taking is protected by the liberal legal order, but privatization is not, okay? This means that if the government A privatizes the university, and then the university gets sold to, you know, some private corporation, and then government B can do it, okay, with no problem. Can do it, can sell the university system, can get some money, can do whatever they want with that money, everywhere. Then if government B gets in office and says, oh, it was a very bad idea to privatize the university, because now the students in this country have to pay, you know, $10,000 a year to get educated, I'm going to renationalize it. They cannot do it unless they have the money to pay it at market value to the corporation that bought it to begin with, okay? And it has to be at market value. Why? So the government cannot reduce it by saying, well, I'm renationalizing the universities out of some sort of a social-oriented idea of education, or to protect, you know, the rights of future generation, introducing any sort of political platform. They just cannot do it, because the European courts will say, no, I'm sorry, this is a taking. Exactly on the same model, exactly on the same model of the NAFTA. Okay? So you guys be careful about, you know, the enthusiasm in entering the European Union, because that means that there is yet another institution, another institutional structure that works to make public interest privatized and making politics the market. Okay? This is another institutional structure that goes institutionally in that direction. Okay, so basically that was the critique that Rodotà and I moved, and others moved to the system. There is an imbalance between transferring of property from the private into the public, as opposed to transferring it from the public into the private. There is an imbalance that is an institutional and constitutional issue, because that means that privatization will happen very fast and nationalization cannot happen. And therefore there is a one-way, free way for transforming commons into capital. Commons is institutionally transformed into capital by the sort of system that is shared through the liberal legal systems, and is shared because it assumes that the public is stronger than the private, and that the public is able to take care of the public interest. But the public today, as I said before, is not able to take care of the public interest because it's completely captured by stronger private interests. Okay? And so the institutional analysis should take care of that. So the Rodotà Commission started to work to propose a transformation of the civil code in Italy that gives some serious guarantees that in cases of privatization of public property, there would be some limits. That there are certain kind of public properties that cannot be privatized under any circumstance, or that there are others that can be privatized, but only after due process of law. Okay? Only if some sort of due process of law happens. In other words, you have to show, you government, you want to privatize, go ahead and privatize, but show me that there is a public interest in privatization, and compensate the commons that have been privatized. Okay? So give to the government the same obligation in privatization that it has to face when it nationalizes. That was the concept. We worked on that for about a year. It came out a draft, and that was, you know, the famous draft of the Rodotà Commission. Then the Prodi government fall. That draft never became formal law. Okay? Was never formalized into a statute, but, and this is one important point, it was never formalized into a statute, but it actually generated case law, a lot of scholarly writings, and a real institutional, a real cultural transformation in the legal scholarship in Italy and elsewhere in Europe as a consequence of that. So it didn't become official law, okay? It didn't become a gazette, but it became Recht, okay? We had to use German or French or Italian words because the English language doesn't have a difference. It didn't become formally a statute, a law, but it entered to become part of the law in the broader sense, okay? Le droit. Pas la loi, mais le droit, okay? So this is what actually happened. And that was really a production of law through social movements, because within the Rodotà Commission, we were, Lucarelli in particular and others, were very much involved since 2001 with the water movement, and therefore we actually came out with water as the first of the commons in the new category that had to be protected and not privatized under no circumstance. Didn't become law, but it generated a very important effect when later on, and we are talking now in 2009, 2010, the Italian government, Berlusconi, decided to try a new shot of privatizations. And it's the referendum that was mentioned before, 2011, the social movement reacted to that privatization move through a referendum, and the referendum was written down by the same lawyers of the Rodotà Commission, and we actually were successful in stopping that privatization. That was a major, major, major success. 250 billion euros were saved to the Italian people by that referendum. Okay, that would have been not only water, but all the private services of the local governments sold at the same time in December 2011. So Italy was on the market, you know, at a certain particular date, all our public property. So it was just, you know, a plunder in its that was stopped like really in the last moment, like in corner, okay? Which didn't generate a lot of friendship for the Commons movement in Italy, actually. The Commons movement became all of a sudden dangerous. So whatever was before some sort of considered some sort of a folkloristic minor group of, you know, people that were basically concerned about something in the long run, all of a sudden became a political force, because it was able to actually damage capitalism in its current form in a very practical and material way. We produced the damage, okay? And that was actually 2011, I'm referring to the discussion of Donatella yesterday, which was one of the years, was perhaps the year in which throughout Europe, and not only, you know, some sort of social movement, there was a social movement moment, okay? The Indignados in Spain, Occupy, and then the Arab Springs, and so on and so forth. That was a particular moment. Italy, in that particular moment, was, in a way, the movement was institutionalizing itself in a referendum vote, right in that area. And then, you know, that was June, and then from July onwards, right after, a series of spaces of very important symbolic importance were occupied. 7 different theaters, starting from Rome, the Teatro Valle, were occupied, but the important thing that were not the occupation as usual ones, but were occupation that had one target. And the target was to create the law for the commons. There was a very, very interesting convergence. And for the first time in Italy, the social movements were actually consciously trying to make the law. Social movements made law throughout the world forever, you know. There is no transformation that civilizes the legal system that is not through social movements. Think about emancipation of the blacks in America, for example, the civil rights movement, but many, many others. The movement, whatever limited the prices of housing, labor movements. Of course, the law reflects the political strengths of the people in a way or another. So in a sense, there is no law that ever doesn't reflect a social movement, including the right to vote. Okay, that's obvious. But usually what happens is that there are the people, you know, the popular masses that are in a way in an pre-insurgency status, And then the elite will understand that and make, you know, transformations in order to give some sort of a satisfaction. So there is a mirror image, okay, of the social movement and the legislator. The legislator is separated anyway and produces law as a reply to certain kind of very strong claims from the bottom up, okay? For example, the law on, you know, lowering or sealing the prices of rental, okay? That happens because people, you know, are actually pushing to get a place to go, and then the legislator say, okay, I have to do something here, and does something. But the difference here with the commons in the occupations in Italy in 2001, it was the conscious idea that the social movement was creating law, and that the social movement was creating law not as law of the lawyers alone, but within a relational, reciprocal conditioning, if you want, of the lawyers as those that were putting, you know, the words of the law on the paper, and the social movement itself, in particular, the artists. In particular, those social movements that were, you know, looking at creativity, that were stemming out of, you know, the transformation of the so-called cognitive phase of capitalism. Okay, so the artists and the lawyers working together to express ideas of the commons. And that went on for about a year. Went on for about a year under huge, huge repression, but it happened, you know, in a variety of places. Not just the theaters, but then around that, many of the other social movements in Italy kind of realized that there was something going on in different parts. And so many different things that before used to be only protest became constituent powers in a way. Became powers that were actually consciously trying to create and to make some law. This went on until about 2013, 2014, okay? And then there was, you know, as usual it happens, you know, there is always this sort of pendular moves of the people's strength. It's hard and tiring. It was very, very tiring on myself and others included, because, you know, we had this sort of thing that was called the Costituente per I beni comuni, Constituent Assembly for the Commons. We would go around Italy, you know, in different places where there were social struggles, a bunch of lawyers together, staying there, talking with the people, coming up with legal drafting. Was a lot of work, and occupations are very tiring, as people know. The moment in which they became really symbolic, they started to be faced by you know, basically police authority. And that was happening in Val di Susa, in particular in the protest against the high-speed train. It happened in the theaters. There have been a lot of violence against social movements, and a lot of violence and exclusion against people that were in a way trying to represent them in the intellectual and public debate. So there was a moment of stop. And this is something where something interesting happened. That there was this sort of, and this is also interesting in the sense of how the law can then come up. Some very moderate scholars from, you know, the moderate left thought that the commons could be a good idea to reform the public administration, okay? So in other words, they said, well, the commons is neither private nor public, but maybe it can be used, you know, in some sort of a moderate, incremental Fabian way to make the public administration become a little more open and a little more horizontal, okay? And so the city of Bologna and many other cities after that came out. There was like a group of scholars that organized themselves to propose these ideas, came out with these things that are called the covenants to participate in the caring of the urban commons, okay? Which is basically some sort of a deal between the mayor of the cities and the local administration and the people that want to actually directly care for some common spaces, that they can make a deal ex ante and actually take care of it. You know, cleaning a park, taking care of a property that is declining, things like that. which cuts really two ways, is very, very dangerous from one certain point of view, because the moment in which you give a park to some petit bourgeois people to clean, and then some migrant person arrives to sleep in the park, they are likely to be feel entitled to kick him out, okay? And therefore, it's just a way to create exclusion through different means, through the narrative of the commons, which is very, very dangerous, because the narrative of the commons is a narrative of inclusion, is a radical narrative of transformation. If you use it in a petit bourgeois form of mind, it's worse than not having it. This must be very clear that is a critique to capitalism we're talking about. To me, you know, when we talk about revolution, when we talk about transformation, we have to consider whether those revolutions go in the direction that is desirable for capitalism or that is contrastive to capitalism. This is to me something that allows to distinguish what is revolution from what is, Gramsci was said, passive revolution, okay? These are concepts that should be very clear in front of us and have to do with the structure of capital. So it's not the same thing to have some regime change, you know, in an Arab world by, or even introduction of democracy, if introduction of democracy is not a move against capitalist extraction. This is to me, this, maybe we disagree on this with Donatella, but I think it's important to keep this in place. So the commons, we organized and we thought about the commons as a countermeasure against capitalist extraction, as a way to stop transformation of commons into capital. And even when we were legislating about the commons with Rodotà, we were clearly thinking we were engaging in a war of position, okay? And I'm still using consciously Gramscian ideas. We were thinking that we were working in a war of position, and we were trying to use the law, the bourgeois law, in a counter-hegemonic way, okay? So you reform the bourgeois law, but in order to play it against itself in a way, okay? So using the narrative of private property and taking in order to protect the commons, for example. And the Teatro Valle was transformed into a foundation. Why it was transformed into a foundation? Because the foundation is a private institution, okay? So paradoxically, and in a way ironically, we were fighting against the privatization of culture by constructing a private institution such a foundation. Because if you create a private institution, a foundation with a long-term vision and target, and then the government tries to take it away from the people, it's going to be stuck with the legal system that protects private property, okay? So you see, it's a counter-hegemonic use of hegemonic institutions of extraction. That we were consciously engaging in that kind of strategy. So what happened with these pacts between local municipalities and the people? Some of those introduced these very dangerous trends towards, you know, let's keep everything very nice and clean and proper, which means let's uniform the way in which people behave, okay? Let's be, you know, a community that is closed in itself, nice and clean, tidy, and if, you know, the migrant arrives, then he's making the community dirty or something like that. So that was dangerous, but when I was a mayor in Chieri with other people, we tried to use that as a way to legalize ex-post occupations, okay? So in other words, the idea was you make a deal between the public administration and the people to clean a park. That's fine. You can make a deal between the public administration and the people to restructure a building. Good. But who tells, according to private law, you can enter in a contract, either expressly by declaring your will or per facta concludente. Okay? So we said, okay, when the people occupy a place, they are concluding a contract with the administration, okay? It's the way in which the people, the community represents itself is through its body activity and not through some formal declaration as a legal institution does. And therefore, there is no illegality in occupations, okay? If the people occupy a place, the administration can decide two things. Either to send the cops and kick everybody out, which happens, but if it can also say, okay, I stay in the deal. I recognize this occupation, I legalize it in a way, ex post, okay? And so the administration is protected against the responsibility of not doing something against an illegal act. Okay? So one of the reasons why the cops are sent to kick out people from occupied places, at least in Italy, is that the mayor and the public administration believe that they have an obligation to do that, otherwise they are liable against, you know, the public administration, against the public money, and so on and so forth. They have an obligation to restore legality. Okay? So what we created in Chieri and Elsewhere was a tool through which, you know, legality could be restored without the risk on the administration side to face consequences. Okay? So that was a very interesting change, because basically it made occupation becoming an offer, a contractual offer. Okay? We are still again in the idea of law, offer and acceptance. That's the way in which you make a deal. Through occupation, the people make an offer to the administration and say, okay, we offer you to take care of this place and to open it up to the people, okay, according to certain rules, okay? And then the administration can say either refuse the offer, but it can accept the offer. If it accepts the offer, all of a sudden, there is a public space that is run directly by the people in an informal way as a civic use. Okay? That model was developed in Naples. We worked on that model in Naples, in the Asilo Filangieri. That is a long story that I have no time to talk about it. But in Naples, now there are 6 places in the city, important spaces, that are run as in this model. In other words, as a civic use, okay? As a civic use, that is to say, as an institution through which the people autonomously create their own law, and in a way, the administration recognized that as something that stays in the legal system as an exercise of sovereign authority of the people. This is actually where we are going now, okay? This is actually what is going on now in Italy, in the sense that we are discussing what? We're discussing this institution of the civic use, which is a very old institution of medieval law. It's a very old institution of medieval law that existed before the Westphalian state was created, existed from the 10th to 12th century. Was the way in which communities were actually running their own common resources. An example would be La Premiata Comunità di Fiemme, which is a place in northern Italy, in Trentino. These people were autonomously cutting the trees of the mountain, and they would keep the trees there for 2 or 3 generations, and then they would sell to season, and then they would sell those trees to the Venetians to actually create Venice. Okay? And Venice today is still standing on trees that were seasoned by the Premiata Comunità di Fiemme. They've been in the water for 300 or 400 years, and they are still up out there in the water, keeping up the palaces. Okay? Because of this commons institution that was a civic use, the way in which autonomously the people in that part of Trentino would actually run with very, very strict rules. You know, they had to season in a certain way. The grandparents were to do it in the interest of their children and the children of the children. It was very long-term community, social, interesting social organization producing its own rules of the game. And the result, the outcome, was the production of the best seasoned tree that there was in that historical time in northern Italy, which was a major production of an important and relevant economic output, okay? Try to put today a furniture of IKEA in the water. 20 days is gone, even less. There, 400 years, the wood is in the water, okay? That's the sense. So you cannot really produce through capitalist production stuff that are as, you know, that are close to those that you could produce with pre-capitalist institution at the time. Okay, so this is pretty much where we're going now. We're going in the sense of trying to re-institutionalize the commons as civic uses, which are based on strong principles of autonomy, that are based on strong claims of direct people participation in the running of the public spaces, particularly, especially the civic spaces, okay? This is where the debate is in Italy. It's both practical. We have a lot of, there is now in the last few months a resurgence of that kind of discussion. There have been many meetings around Italy. This is where we are going in the, so to say, in the scholarly understanding and in the practice, in the practical production of law. There are things around there going on. So there are different municipalities trying to write new forms of those kind of horizontal agreements I was talking to you before, taking into consideration that. My own city, Torino, is doing that. Actually, I'm doing it for them, and will become one of the new pieces of recognition of the civil uses in a large city in Italy, which is going to be important for, you know, as a model for the others. There is a project to, again, try to move and transform the civil code throughout the participation of the actual struggles that are around. So seeing the civil code as a really obsolete artifact today, based on ideas and understanding of a reality that were good at the time of modernity, when you needed to transform commons into capital. But today, in our world in which there is too much capital and there are no more commons, is absurd to have fundamental legal rules of private law that still work in the direction of transformation of our commons into capital. So that is happening. And then finally, and this is just, and I'm done with it, there is this very strange dialectic, which is very difficult to understand, between social movements as producers of law as a direct involvement, which is a cultural practice in a way, which is a claim of direct sovereignty over the law, which is basically looking at the law itself as a commons, and the social movements that actually transform themselves in political institution of constituted authority. So the Podemos 5 stars kind of phenomenon, okay? Social movements that started in a certain particular moment on certain particular issues that were clearly the issues of water, the issues of participation, the issues of 1%, all that kind of stuff. But then they become, and they try to transform those kind of things into political representation. So, 5 stars in Italy was also, you know, a movement for, was in the water campaign, was not even yet 5 stars when it started. It was those people who were into the struggles in Val Susa, everywhere, and then they became a party. And that transformation was made possible by technology. So in a way, the only successful transformation of social movements into representation is through technology. And technology today, you know, in this late phase of capitalism, in this phase of, you know, I call it techno-fascism, but, you know, it might be a little extreme, but this is, you can call it late capitalism, you can call it cognitive capitalism. There are many ways to point out at the phase in which we are, but certainly what happens is that through technology, the diffuse power that is part of social movement has been channeled and concentrated in the hands of platforms. Okay, that become, in a way or another, the places of decision and that reproduce in the virtual space the structures of traditional parties, or even more vertical structures. And this is a big tension, because in a way, you see, social movements are by themselves commons, in the sense that the conditions of participation into social movements is a condition of cooperation. When we do something as a social movement, we do something together. We want to kick out some guys. We want to maintain the water public. We want to defend the basin of the river. Okay, we are doing something together. And when I go with my friends to do a political action, we are together. The moment in which this is transferred in representative politics, the competitive model kicks in. So all of a sudden, we are not anymore doing something together in a diffused way, but we are actually competing to be the one who represents that movement. So the vertical structure, which is based on exclusion, enters the scene. So 4 friends going out there to campaign for water as a common, they are really 4 friends and 4 comrades. 4 comrades going there in a political campaign, they are structurally fighting for who of the 4 is going to be elected and who not, okay? So there is this competitive vertical power system structure of representation that actually makes, to my mind, incompatible with the idea of the social movements. But what made it compatible more recently, and here we need, thoughts and understanding, is this new technological transformation. The technology is actually the technological conditions of production of the current phase are actually making it possible electronically to take the diffuse forces of the social movement and concentrate it. Whether this is hijacking or whether this is a new phase of our struggles is all to be seen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ugo. We have wait a second. We have a cab. Yes, Ugo is leaving to the airport at 5 to 11, so we have 20 to 25 minutes to answer your questions, which are very much welcome.
Thank you. Please.
Andrei?
Thank you for this inspiring lecture. My question was, before you mentioned the historical facts about Italian example of creating common property, was actually the reversed example in England, that we actually had privatization of the land as a first example of like a hijacking common property and transforming it into a private. And one of the arguments which they said, and you actually mentioned, so John Locke and the poet John Davis in the 16th and the 17th century had an idea about the land as a property which could be transformed into capital because someone who does that transformation or privatization can actually use it to produce profit. And by making profit, there is a right to make it private. So you said that, I actually could read 2 arguments in your lecture, so that there is a point that people who make common property or use it can actually use it more productively than private owners, and you have like utilitarian argument, which would be that many people have benefit from creating common property. So I wanted to know that do you think that there is another argument beside that, economic and utilitarian, for creating common property by social movements? And my other question was about technology. So you said that technology enables us to act through social movements, but don't you think that that same technology is actually not subverted to the principle of the common good? I mean, look at Facebook. It is a privately owned, very profitable business, but actually it enables us to act the way you said, to create common good. Thank you.
Well, these are two very interesting and important questions. I don't think they are unmaking my argument in any way. I was basically what I think there is an argument to say, okay, this is the old discussion between Garrett Hardin versus Elinor Ostrom, right? In a way, whether the commons, the use of the commons as a resource is actually more tragic or actually desirable. And this is an economic discussion. Ostrom came out with a lot of material saying, oh, actually it's better to common, people common for money time, blah, blah, blah. I'm not really interested in that so much. I mean, of course, that's part of the discussion. I'm much more interested in whether, because that is a complete internal to capitalism kind of discussion. It's not only within capitalism, but it's also within positivism. This idea of the commons as something that is out there, and the commoners something that some subjects, you know, that deal with the commons in a way, manage the commons in some sort of technocratic, distant way. The commons is a life experience, is a transformation, is a process of transformation of yourself and your society that starts from a very radical critique of positivism, of mechanicism, of you know, of the division of knowledge and labor in a way that is exploited. Okay, and it is false consciousness. So the commons work in that kind of scenario to me. Then I actually believe that we can, and I actually totally agree with you, and that was why I closed the lecture the way I did. You know, clearly people like Beppe Grillo in Italy or of Iglesias in Spain, and there are many others, can be seen as heroes of the commons in the sense that they are introducing in the political space some sort of the themes that we had in mind at the time of the occupations. Okay, that's out of the question. So they did exactly that. But in the very moment they are doing that, and that's my question is, they actually betrayed structurally the way in which the commons can be a transformation. So this was my big question mark at the end. Okay, I just think that there is a technological enablement to do that. When at the end of the water referendum, this is a small history, very small history, but I lived it personally. At the end of the water referendum, when there was the victory, it was 27 million people that voted for us. Okay, it was a major thing. In Italy, no one expected it. Was really a particularly strange moment of Italian history. Okay? So we convened, after finished that, like a couple of months after, there was a convention in Florence to try to discuss whether it was possible to transform that stuff into political representation. Okay? And that were a very large assembly gathered, about 5,000 people, was really big thing. Okay? And then at the end of the thing, there was some motion to create a movement called ALBA, Alleanza Lavoro per i Comuni Ambiente, stuff like that. But it was very clear at the moment, by many of us, that it was something that would not happen. Meanwhile, it could happen exactly the same thing by Beppe Grillo through technology. So I think that, and I think that a lot of what was Pablo Iglesias in Spain was very similar. You know, he actually was present in the Puerta del Sol through YouTube, okay, through actual comments. So the transformation of this sort of sparse force into political representation, its constituted political representation, was made possible by technology, and the refusal of use technology of some of us, and I'm completely Luddite from this perspective. I do believe that the moment in which something is filtered by Facebook or Twitter is not revolutionary by definition, okay? I deeply believe that. I disbelieve entirely that you can organize a revolution by having the CIA in Cupertino having all the data of where you meet, at what time, and what you do, okay? This is absurd. I mean, believing that there is no centralized control by the cops and the forces of restoration into the social media is like complete infantile kind of vision. Okay, so that's to me is very clear. Then another question is whether it is possible in some ways to use in a counter-hegemonic way technology as much as we use in a counter-hegemonic way law. But it's very difficult to do, and it requires a lot of subjectivity. Not a little bit of subjectivity, a huge amount of subjectivity. Because if you don't have that, you are an idiot. You are a believer, and you believe, and you are, you know, useful to something that is basically making a normalization of potential forces of capitalist transformation. And this is, you know, my claim and my problem with the representation of the commons. This, I think, would be my remark.
Thank you. Thank you for the lecture. I want you focused with your
Thank you. You focused with your explanations and with your example on a national level engaging in changing law or seeing law as common. Could you also adopt this on international law, international public law, maybe? Do you have some? I don't really have a really detailed question, but I would like to know your opinion about that.
Well, this is another. I'm right now, as we are talking, editing a volume for the International Academy of Comparative Law, which is an established institution of academic blah blah that does a meeting every 4 years. This year is going to be in Japan. There is a whole board, of established professors, and then you kind of get. You write a questionnaire, you send to a number of people, and each one of them will answer to your questionnaire, and then you do the sort of the general reporter, does that. And I'm doing one on the commons. So it's kind of interesting because you get normal lawyers, okay, ordinary lawyers. You don't get to pick them because they are picked by the National Association. So you are the general editor, you write a questionnaire, and you get the answers that are picked by the local organizations, usually following some sort of patterns of a local academic authority. So I can assume that the people that are appointed to answer to my questionnaire are relatively mainstream lawyers representative of the legal system of the country, okay? And so I have this questionnaire, and I'm now having 17 or 18 legal systems. I'm working on all of that stuff. And international law is actually the area in which the commons is globally part of the discourse. So what a lawyer think, a normal ordinary lawyer think when gets involved with the world of commons is actually the common pools, the common welfare, the common heritage of humankind ideas, the atmosphere, the Antarctica, things like that. So there is a narrative of the commons as stuff belonging to everybody, which is in a way, the origins of international law. And the origins of international law, Ugo Grotius wrote the first famous book of international law, was called Mare Liberum, which was an argument that the sea could not be under private property, had to remain open, okay? And that, of course, was an argument in favor of the corporation that was his client at the time, that was the VOC, the East Indian Company. But the point was that international law was born on the idea that certain kind of things should be kept open, okay? So there is a dimension of the commons, which I don't think, however, but this is again something in which there is discussion in literature and stuff. I think that the commons need to have some proximity, a large amount of proximity. Okay? I think that commoning is an experience of our bodies. Okay? Is doing stuff together, is putting our bodies together, is claiming the law in a physical way as part of us, as our language, as something that is really part of us. Is doing stuff together. So it seems to me that at the moment in which you construct a remote, already the state is very remote from the people. You see, the big problem of representation is that once you get elected in office, you don't take the bus anymore. You are not anymore part of. You don't have to pay the rent in the same way. Okay, you're not an ordinary human. You're not part of the masses anymore. I don't know how to explain that. There is an institutional separation. You become part of a leadership, and the understanding is there are those that lead and those that follow, the up and the down. Okay? And then the whole political conversation is in the up, the right and the left, but still at the up. My question is, how can we make politics become a politics that is not divided in right and left at the top, but is between bottom and top? Okay? That seems to me that is the issue that's out there. And to do that, you need proximity. So I think that the commons is an institution that has to have some proximity. Okay? So the global commons conveys issues and problems that to me are not the same that are the issues and problems of possible transformations of the way that people are. So the anthropological transformation that is required. Actually, the commons at the global level are institutions that have been serving capitalist extraction for a long time. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk and for your answers. I'm particularly interested.
Because we have 10 minutes.
Okay, I will try to be really quick. So I'm interested in this relationship between politics of commons and representation politics, specifically focusing on the relationship between like people coming from the movements of commons and the Cinque Stelle movement. That is now in a really, let's say, specific position, and in the future it might be able to, put these laws, in place. What I am concerned about is a lot of, let's say, nationalistic, anti-migrant, anti-refugee sentiment that is nowadays coming out of the party. So how do you think that these two things are compatible, and do you discuss this friction, and is there something as a nationalist commons as a possibility, or this is like completely out of picture? I don't know. How do you see this? How do you discuss this?
This is again a corruption of representation. Seems to me that the fact that the commons risk at becoming identity closed commons is because these people have to gain votes in competitive scenarios against other crazy, other people that believe that way. But has nothing to do with the commons itself. The commons itself, as a narrative, as an experience, as a way of being, is an open community, is an ecological component of society, is by definition in communication with every other community, is an hybridization, has not even defined boundaries. The commons defines, challenges the idea of the boundary. A society based on the commons will be a society in which the state goes away, is not there. You have to abolish the frontiers. It's a way to stay together in a different way. It's a revolution. It's a transformation. It's internationalist by itself, but doesn't require the building block of the state, doesn't require the building block of private property. It requires some kind of more general rethinking of social organization. Okay? Then the way in which the commons is deployed and the risks they are talking about are all there. But those are not something that have nothing to do with the narrative of the commons. I challenged you to find anything that was written on the commons by anybody that was a common scholar that contains, even on grain, the possibilities of that kind of stuff. I showed you, and I showed you in something that not many people say, in this sort of pact to care together about the city, some kind of risk. So we need to be very aware of the risk of saying, okay, the people take care of this garden, and therefore that is a common. Okay, be careful that then can create some sort of counterintuitive, reaction, which is maybe they become racist and they become, petit bourgeois on that little park, and they kick out the migrants. But that is nothing, so we need to be very careful, and your questions are very important to keep attention up, but I don't believe that, the commons and the closed community are something that have nothing to do with each other. It's just a structural different thing, It's exclusion against inclusion. Is diffusion of power against concentration, or structured different stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, building on this last point, wouldn't then this idea of the commons not also imply some idea of public authority that needs to be redefined? You are talking of institutions of the commons. So what kinds of institutions are these? Because you seem to rely, last but not least, on state structures. You fight your struggle in Italy, but states have proven to be very bad, very unwilling, and also increasingly very inefficient defenders of the public good. So we would need to think of some sort of pooling of sovereignty, because states are not only compromised by capitalist markets, but states also are very bad defenders of the public good, because they compete themselves at the international scene for the public good, and they do this in a system of anarchy of states. So what sort of pooling of sovereignty do you foresee this at all, and what kind of institutions would this be? What is the role of the EU here, of the UN, or are there any institutions that could kind of support this struggle?
Okay, well, first of all, I don't think that you can find anything in my scholarship from back in the 80s to now that says anything good about states. Okay,
Yeah.
so I don't see where you, in this lecture, they say something about the good about the state in this lecture. I don't believe so. So I don't believe that the state is the friend of the commons. I don't believe that the commons require the state. I don't believe that the commons require sovereignty even, okay? So that the concept of sovereignty is a construction of modernity as much as the concept of private property is an institution of concentration of power, is an institution of domination, is an institution of class extraction. So it's a vertical institution that I want to get rid of. And I believe that the commons is an institutional setting that stems from a radical redefinition of the spaces of the political. Okay? So in other words, I don't think that's what they were trying to say about 5 stars and Pablo was the actual fact that the political, when the political goes away from the people, from the masses, how do you want to call them, from the commoners, from the movements, whatever, and the political gets concentrated in a top part that looks down to the masses, in that moment, the tension with the commons appears completely and it becomes extremely difficult to do anything that is really transformative. So that was my point. So the point is, I imagine the construction of institutions of the commons as institutions of proximity. So people actually producing stuff together, actually factories, there are examples here and there, occupied factories that work on egalitarian ideas and on participation, equality of salaries, this kind of stuff, okay? So I regard the institutions of the commons to me are those institutions that emerge out of a radical critique of private property and sovereignty, and in a way, like in an ecological system, okay, produce. Say that you have this is an example I use a lot in my book Ecology of Law, but it seems to me that is very clarifying. You have a lake that is under eutropia, so it's dying, okay, and you identify what is the element that makes it die, and you have to solve the problem, okay? If you're a technocrat, you try to, use some sort of top-down technological ways to restore the lake, or in the lagoon in Venice, you have the problem with water coming out. You kind of create this huge thing in order to solve the problem. If you're an ecologist, you understand the problem. You look at an area, you protect it from the external aggression, and you let it recover. And then this area, you open it up a little bit with another area, and another area, and another area. So I think the commons is a way to look at the political reality, to do politics in a variety of ways that cannot be defined exactly, that can be, as long as they are radical critiques of capitalism, as long as they try to create a different world, they will end up working together, connecting with each other, but they have to institutionalize themselves. So whenever you occupy a place, you should not just stay there selling beers, but you should actually try to create some sort of institutional setting in connection with others, okay, to create the first knot of that network that ultimately will allow us to actually have some sort of emancipation. Okay? I think I have to go.
If I may add, through strong subjectivities against moderate.
Yeah, of course. Bullshit moderate. Yeah. Okay.